This is House Planning Help, episode 262. Hi there, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build, because I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up in this session, my guest is Dr. Mike Page from the University of Hertfordshire, and we're going to be hearing about the Cube project, which is a micro home. Actually, more than that, I suppose it's different prototypes that they have gone through. A strong demand for this, but they came up against quite a big constraint in the mass rollout of it. You know, they're thinking, we've got strong demand, we're going all the way here. So what happened next? That's what we're going to find out today. Just wanted to mention, it's our 7th birthday. Well, strictly speaking, it's not our 7th birthday because I missed it a couple of weeks ago and I looked in the calendar. It's been summer holidays here, and so the kids have all been in the house. It's just been a bit crazy trying to get on with work and everything. I've missed our 7th birthday. Anyway, happy birthday, House Planning Help. And we intend to be here as long as we can. Hopefully we've got lots more mileage left, particularly if we can get our second construction project off the ground. That's what will keep us motoring along and learning new things as well. Getting back to today, though, so I'm fascinated with the tiny house movement, and I suppose most of the interviews that we've done have been based out in the US. And I've had this question at the back of my mind, well, what about the UK? Why is it not such a big thing here? And although today's podcast is really on a slightly different aspect of tiny homes, or micro homes, as Dr. Mike Page will refer to them, I think we're going to get to the bottom of this. Why it's not such a big movement here in the UK. I started by asking Mike to tell me a little bit about his background.
I read engineering science at Oxford in the late 1980s, and then I went into artificial intelligence and became a cognitive psychologist. And so I'm a strange mixture of cognitive psychology and engineering, but actually for the job that we have to do on global warming, climate change, that's probably not a bad place to be, because I suspect that the mitigation of climate change is going to be as much changing behavior, which is psychology, as technology, which is engineering. So not a bad mixture, it turns out, but an odd career path.
We're going to talk about the Cube project today and some of the issues that you came up against. There's quite a lot in here too, particularly I'm hoping to touch on land, which yes. I know maybe you're not so keen to talk about, but that seems to be one of the big challenges. So first of all, how did the whole Cube project begin?
So I work at the University of Hertfordshire, and in about 2008, there was a little more money around. It was before the financial crisis, and there was money around for cross-department work, cross-department projects. And so I said to I had been interested in green building techniques and potentially looking at the psychology of pro-environmental behavior change for a while. And I said to my colleagues, well, you know, why don't I'd seen the Munich compact home, which was a 2.6 by 2.6 by 2.6 meter micro home. And I said, why don't we do something like that, but with an emphasis on demonstrating to people all the things they could do in a building of any size, that was very important, to live a low or zero carbon life, but with modern comforts, not in a yurt in mid-Wales with a bucket and spade. So I suggested this project called the Cube Project to this cross-departmental funding body in the university, and somewhat to my surprise, they said yes. So I launched into the design and actually getting companies to come in and talk. We had talks from people about composting loos and reed beds, and we had talks from Mitsubishi Electric, who are nearby in Hatfield, and about EcoDown and air source heat pumps. And the idea behind it really was to try and find out what the best thing to do would be, as I say, in a building of any size, and then put it in a building of a small size so that we could take that building around and show people. I mean, Wittgenstein said that some things have to be shown, they can't just be explained. And I think there's some truth in that with regard to eco-housing or particular technologies. You have to show people that these things work and they're not over-complex. And like LED lighting, people were very suspicious of it because they'd associated it with compact fluorescent tubes. They said, oh, it takes a long time to warm up, it's full of mercury, etc., etc. Now, that's not true of LED lighting. None of it's true of any LED lighting. But you know, I suppose the idea was to do low environmental behavior change by design. so that people didn't always have to think so hard about what they were doing, because if you rely on people thinking hard about trying to save energy, most of the time, in psychological terms, they're getting on with their lives and they're not thinking hard about saving energy. So what you've got to do is make it the default, so they can almost do nothing else in a house, but you've got to make it so that they have their comfort and the sort of quality of life that they want. And that's what we were trying to do in the Q project, trying to pull together a suite of things, some of which we'll probably talk about, all of which will contribute to a low carbon lifestyle, but none of which will impinge on anybody having a decent quality of life.
Having that small building, the cube, to begin with, that's probably one of the most ecological things you can do. So that being important too. I know you're saying that you wanted to demonstrate it on all houses.
Absolutely. So one of the ways I have boats as well. I'm interested in boats. I built a boat once, and there is that idea of compact living. In a boat, you can have something which is a galley 1 minute, a galley kitchen 1 minute, and then it turns into a place to sleep. And then sometimes it's an office where you chart a course or whatever. And it's a multifunctional space. And there are some things you can do you can have a large house and then have zoned heating, such that you try and arrange it so that you're only heating the bit that you're in. Or you can have lighting so that the lights turn off in the bits that you're not in. So that's one way of doing it. We have quite complex controls to make sure you're not heating or lighting bits that you're not in. The other way of looking at it was to always be in the same place and make sure you could fulfill all the different functions. So that was the sort of conceit. And we settled upon, for QB1, which was the first Q project, and people can see these pictures of these on qproject.org.uk. For QB1, we decided upon a 3 by 3 by 3 meter space in which one person or a friendly couple could live a comfortable modern existence, but with a minimum environmental impact, mostly characterized as carbon emissions. And we took that in 2011 to the Edinburgh Science Festival, and that was QB1. Subsequent to QB1, lots of people got in touch and said, I'm quite interested in that. Even though we hadn't set it out as we want people to live in small spaces project.
Oh, so that's interesting.
Yeah.
So people were then starting to think, I'd like a small space, but that wasn't your intention.
Absolutely. So lots of people came around and said, hey, that's really cool. I'd like a space like that. Well, then I realized that QB1 was slightly restricted. The bed wasn't a full-size double bed. It was what's called a small double bed. And there was some restrictions. You could only have 2 people sitting down to eat. So I designed QB2, which was like a stretch QB1. It was 3 meters by 4 meters in plan and 3 meters the internal height. So what's that, 36 cubic meters? That gives you a whole lot more flexibility. It gives you a really decent set of spaces, a decent 4 meter long bathroom, a galley kitchen, a full-size double bed, 4-seater table, storage space, lots of storage space, place for a washing machine, everything you want to do, you can do in a couple of people could live quite happily in QB2. Now, again, I wasn't saying that everybody either should or would want to live in it, but we got a lot of inquiries of people, I'd really like, I'd love to live in a place like that. And I had to say that whilst I absolutely am not saying that people should live in small spaces, and that's particularly important to say on a day like today when the Children's Commissioner has had to report that there were 200,000 children in the UK living in very inadequate accommodation, whole families stuffed into
but I think
shipping containers. And
we've got
like
to draw a line here and say that there's something very different between a person choosing to live like this. And I think for one person, I can actually imagine myself, if I was on my own, I would almost be tempted. It would be either go down the co-housing route and join a group, or it could well be going into a tiny house of some description. So just on the size again, when you're doing these sorts of prototypes, the second you have more space, even if we're talking a meter, 10 meters, everything changes. You can't. I know what you were trying to demonstrate, that this can happen in all sizes of houses, but you had a lot of bits and pieces in there that would move this way and move that.
Absolutely. Yeah, we had some constraints as well. I didn't want anything that folded up. I didn't allow any ladders.
Why?
Well, because if you have something that folds up, like a table or something like that, so the original Munich compact house had a bed which folded up and then the table was underneath. Now, it was my view, and this might be the psychologist coming out, or it might just be me being lazy, but basically, whenever you want to fold something up, it's always going to be inconvenient, right? If you have to fold away a table to go to bed, you're going to have coffee cups and computer work, and you've left the work, and now you're going to have to tidy it all away to go to bed. It's inconvenient. Or what if one person's still in bed, but you still want to use the towel? It's always going to be inconvenient to have things folding up. Now, I did have some things, the table sort of slid to the side so that you could have more space, or you could have 4 people, 2 on each side, or you could slide it to the wall and have a space where you put your feet up to watch TV, and that was configurable. But never was there a place where you would have to get something out of the way to fold something up and then you couldn't use it. So everything was always usable, and that was a design rule which we had. The other design rule was that we wouldn't use technology that was only appropriate to small spaces, because of this wider view that we had, that we wanted to demonstrate what could be done in any size house, or any size building, the size of the Pentagon. You could all use LED lighting, air source heat pumps, heat recovery ventilation was another thing we had. We had a composting loo in there. We had low flow water outlets, particularly hot water. That was an interesting thing to demonstrate to people. All the energy in hot water is basically in the hot, not in the water. It takes about a kilowatt hour of energy to get a ton of water to your cold water tap. And if you put another kilowatt hour into it, you'll warm that ton of water up by just over 1 degree centigrade, or just under 1 degree centigrade, rather. So you're going to warm it up in the hot water by 30, 40 degrees centigrade. So 31ths of the energy is in the heat, not in the water. So you want your low flow shower head, in energy terms at least, much more than you want a sort of low cold water flows. Now, you might be in an area of water drought, as it were, or water scarcity. So that would be another reason. But from an energy point of view, you want to restrict the flows of hot water. We actually had a composting loo in there, which also...
that's taking things... Well, I don't know. Is it taking things a bit hard?
Well, we worked with Andy Warren, and who's in Mid Wales, in Llanidloes, and works a lot with the people at Machynlleth, the Centre for Alternative Technology. And we found that it was, yes, whilst it was going a little bit far, it does allow you to have one more degree of separation. It's one fewer thing to connect when you're moving the cube. Having said that, you still need something for the kitchen waste, so it's not quite as brilliant as it sounds. But the composting loo itself worked really well, but it gave some really nice technical problems about what you do when you've got a composting loo, but you've also got heat recovery ventilation, so you've got an extract in the kitchen. Now, these things can't be very far apart in the cube, so if you put a big extractor fan in the kitchen, it starts sucking air back through the loo, which is not what you want to do. The composting loo wants to have a continuous flow of air into it. So we actually managed to, even in that compact space, we had air going into the composting loo, through the composting loo, so it was drawing air into the loo so it never smelled, and it really didn't smell. And then it went through a heat exchanger before going out, and then fresh air was coming in somewhere else. So we had an air heat exchanger, even though it was being drawn into the composting loo. And then we had a recirculating hood in the kitchen. So it was really quite complex. And, there was some decisions we really couldn't get wrong, because if you have an extract of a normal case, it would have sucked smelly air back out of the loo. So there were some lovely design problems and some lovely spatial problems, which I hope we solved in an interesting way. We had 2 meter head height throughout the whole thing. We had all mod cons, as it were, and we didn't have anything less than 2 meter head height anywhere in the cube. So we'd used every cubic centimeter effectively. We had a full-size shower. We had a 4-burner induction hob. We had, as I say, air source heat pump, fan coil heating, 32-inch LED TV.
Yeah, this is sounding a bit like a playground. Did this get road tested?
Yes, people have lived in it, and we had various celebrity road tests. Tom Heap from Radio 4's Costing the Earth stayed in it a couple of nights. We then lent it to a place of housing need, and there were people living in it for several years, and we then sold it to a housing agency who, as far as I know, is still operating it. So it was tested in anger, as it were.
What feedback did you get from that then?
Great. We had they actually had 2 people living in it, and one of them had allergies against a lot of the things that they would have got if they'd been in the sort of hostel for people who didn't have homes, permanent homes to go to, in a London borough, and they had a lot of allergies, and so they really couldn't live in there. And because all of ours was wood and cork and nice materials, not outgassing, very little dust, there was a couple of people who lived in there very happily for over a year and got really good feedback. I didn't meet everybody who stayed in it over the years, but we got really good feedback. One problem, not a problem, but one issue was the fact that it had alternating tread staircase in it, actually. It sounds ridiculous in something that's only 3 meters from floor to ceiling, but it was actually a really important way of getting up to the bed, which was above the living area, and there was a sort of standing off place for the kitchen, which then you could put the tanks underneath, all sorts of things like that. Obviously, for people with restricted mobility, that wasn't perfect. And that led me to design QB3. And QB3 was the same internal volume, but it was all on one level. So it was 6 meters by 3 meters in plan and 2 meters or 2 and a bit meters from floor to ceiling. And in that, which we did for the Edinburgh Science Festival in 2016 with my colleague Marek Schubert, and we had a different solution to the how do you make multiple use of the floor space you have in plan. So in QB2, we had things above other things. But so we had the bed above the sitting and dining and living area. Now, that's not available to you when you've only got 2 meters of floor to ceiling height. We had moving walls, so you could actually step out of the kitchen, wind a wall past you, and step back onto the same floor, which was now in the bathroom. And that was a nice bit of fun. And going right back to the original point, you only have to insulate that small space. You only have to light that small space. The same light, when you can move a wall, does for the kitchen as does for the bathroom. And in fact, we had 2 moving walls, so the bedroom then swapped with the lounge as well. So you only have to insulate a small perimeter, and you can have light and other things which do double duty. And we had triple glazed windows and doors and all sorts of things like that. Yeah.
So going back to the people who have shown interest, did you ever want to take things further, or was it always just research?
Yeah, no, we actually licensed the build and sale of these to our very good colleagues in a company called Bolton Buildings. They're not called Bolton because they're in Lancashire, but they're called Bolton because they bolt things on. They have a license to actually build cubes. QB2 or QB3 would be the natural ones to build. But the problem has always been, and we had taken it to Grand Designs Live in XL in London, 10 days. There was never a time in 10 days from 9 till 6 or whatever when we didn't have a queue of people waiting for the tour of the Cube project. We literally we must have showed 3,000 people through just that week. We did it in Birmingham. We'd been in the Edinburgh Science Festival. And every time we said, I'd love one of these, people would say, I'd love one of these. My son or daughter's going to university, she would love one of these. Or if we had one of these in the garden for my mother or the carers, or I have to stay. So we had loads and loads of interest. And it always founded on an issue which I guess is close to your heart as well, which is the availability of land. All the people who wanted one were exactly the same set of people who didn't have land to put it on. And because the Cube project is a self-contained dwelling house, although it does come under we were very careful to keep it within the definition of a caravan under the Caravan Act, 1968, whatever it is. It fits all the descriptions of a caravan. It's mobile, it's got the right dimensions. In fact, a caravan can be 20 meters by 6.8 meters on the outside. So ours is vastly smaller than the biggest caravan you could have. But it meets the definition of a caravan. But even a static caravan that's treated as a separate dwelling house needs planning permission. And you need land with planning permission. And so, I suspect that the people were sort of thinking, well, if I had land with planning permission, then I wouldn't need to build a micro house. I'd just build myself a normal house. And if it was in the south of England, probably then I'd sell it and move to the north of England or to Wales, where I come from. But that was the issue. It came down to a land issue. And whilst people could put it in their garden, as it were, you could put a cube in your garden, you can put a caravan in your garden. Its use has to be incidental to the use of the house. It can't be a self-contained dwelling house. Now, you and I have both heard stories, I'm sure, of people living in sheds in London, rented to them by landlords who ought to know better. But we weren't prepared to go down that line. What we would have liked was some facility. And another thing, we never wanted it to be for people living in isolation. we always thought, as you mentioned earlier, that a group of young people could get a sort of site in the city even. We didn't want it to just necessarily be up in the Scottish Highlands, miles from anywhere. City living is eco-friendly living in many ways, because you're not having to get in petrol vehicles and move around. Quite sustainable to be in the city with public transport. But if young people could get access to a small amount of land, and we went to various boroughs and pushed with them, where they could build a small community of cubes, maybe around some common space, maybe around some growing space, some allotments or something like that.
What about thinking of a caravan park? Can you just take something like this and put it on there, or does it have to have wheels?
No, you can take something and put it on there. I mean, if a site has been designated for static caravans, then yes, that would be perfect. And indeed, if a council had such a site, it could be private, it could be council owned, or it could be something that's previously had permission and has fallen into disuse or whatever. That would be a perfect place to put such a community. Of course, however, the temptation is, because you can pick up a sort of highly uninsulated, fan electric heated static caravan for, say, £10,000, that the council would then, or a private landlord might be then tempted to put very shoddy housing on there, and the energy use would be enormous, and that wasn't the aim of our project. So really the aim of our project was about demonstrating low energy. And if we had access to a caravan site or a place with permission for static caravans, we could build a very, very low energy very community. I think we could build a nice community. But, as I say, what we really need is full-size houses, and so that's something I've been concentrating on more recently. But I'm
going to keep you on this for a while.
No, absolutely right. And
so
that's what this is about.
Tiny houses, then, do they exist at the moment in the UK? I know our housing stock, actually, I lived in a house, perhaps not tiny, but in a terraced house that was maybe 60 square metres and very good space for a couple. Perhaps when the kids came along, it was not so ideal. But going smaller than that, how does it exist in the UK?
The term tiny house comes from the US, and we started this in 2008, as I said, and it really wasn't a term then, but there were some people who've been doing it, and they're often trailable, they're often mobile in the tiny houses in the US. And that's fine if you're happy to basically lodge it somewhere, but then move around. That puts restrictions on it. If it's going to be mobile, if it's got to be towable behind a car, then it's going to have to be less than 2.5 meters wide. It's going to have to be less than a certain weight. And there are caravans, of course, that tow behind vehicles, which obviously are functionally equivalent to tiny houses. But there's not a very big, that I know of, population of static tiny homes that are not just static caravans on park homes and things like that. And
is this the problem, that is what happens when you divide up the land like this? You tend to adopt that model?
Yes, they tend to be therefore in holiday places or retirement places, and you can actually make a nice static caravan for a retirement village, but they tend to be in privately owned sites, and they charge big leasehold, to be there, and it's difficult for you to sell them on without paying, there's been stuff in the news recently, it can be difficult to sell them on without paying a big premium to the caravan park owner. And so there's not a very friendly set. And these sites are obviously that have permission to do this are in limited supply. So whilst there are what would call tiny homes physically, then they're not of the type that we were doing, which was sort of eco-friendly and meant to be fairly static and not moving around. The QB2 was 5.3 tons, and so you couldn't really tow it behind a vehicle. It was 3.5 meters wide, so you couldn't tow it behind any car. You had to put it on a lorry. It was mobile, so it met the definition of a caravan, which is, as I say, quite a broad definition. But it wasn't the sort of thing that people have done. And so they've been one-offs. There have been lots of one-offs, people towing things, people turning horse boxes into tiny... And George Clark's Amazing Spaces program has been very good at showing these individual efforts, but there's been no concerted effort to make some sort of planning arrangement that would allow groups of people to come together and maybe decide that that's what they wanted, a little network of smaller houses. Yeah.
One of our hub members, Emma, is currently researching the idea of trying to move into something smaller. I'm going to read out a few of her questions because I think it's quite good for context. If tiny houses are under the same regulations as mobile homes, can they be permitted as a permanent residence in the same way that mobile homes are permitted for the retired?
Yes, I mean, mobile home is a bit of a misnomer, really, because most of them are static homes, so they're static caravans. They all come under the Caravan Act, if they meet the definition of the Caravan Act, which all of ours do. But, it has to be less than 3.05 metres from floor to ceiling, for instance, which is why we made it 3. So yes, basically, the tiny homes that we make and a lot of people make would come under the Caravan Act, which is the same thing that covers static caravans.
Now, this one here is interesting because we've sort of touched on this. There are many mobile home parks marketed for the over 45s. It would make sense that other plots of land can have mobile homes for younger families of any age. It would also make sense if this means one can build a mobile home on their own private plot of land as well. If not, then why is this not permitted when it is accepted for the retired generation?
Well, very much along the lines of what I've been saying, really, that they are there for the retirement community, but not for young people, and particularly for young people in cities. So I couldn't agree with Emma more, apart from her classification of people over 45 as being sort of elderly. But,
I'm getting very close to that.
Myself, I take exception to that.
We might find ourselves repeating a little bit here. Are the building regulations potentially discriminating against the younger working force of this country to have access to the same building rights as the over 45s?
Look, I need to say that I'm an engineer turned cognitive psychologist. I'm not a lawyer, but caravans are not buildings, so building regulations don't apply to caravans. Now, obviously, safety regulations apply to caravans. They can't be, fireboxes, but they are not buildings, and therefore building regulations don't apply. But take the spirit of Emma's question. I think it's more the planning regulations that are conspiring against what we wanted to do with the Q project, which is to let people live in their own private spaces with groups of other people nearby in pleasant and low carbon surroundings. And I think it's a planning issue, not a building regulations issue. I'm all in favour of building regulations because I think every new home that's built in the UK should be zero carbon or carbon positive. And it's another issue which we're not talking about now, but we could.
If a tiny home is built to meet all of the UK's building regulations in the same way a regular home would be built for permanent residence, would this be then allowed on a privately owned piece of land? So even if it is under the regulation of a mobile home, can it be accepted as permanent residence as opposed to a temporary holiday or caravan home when parking it on a plot of land is limited to a specific period of time?
Right, so there's lots of stuff there. Okay, so taking into account what I just said about a caravan not being building regulations, you can live in a caravan. Indeed, that's what these static home parks is the legislation they're operating under. But they do need planning permission because they are self-contained homes. And that's the issue. You need planning permission for a self-contained home in the form of a static caravan. But absolutely, that would be one thing you could do, but it's nothing to do with building regulations per se. There was another bit in the question and in the previous question about potentially building on your own plot of land and putting one in your garden or a plot of land that you own. That comes back to the previous part of our conversation where I said, yes, you can put something in the curtilage of your main dwelling house, but its use has to be incidental and not separate from the use of the house. So it can be an annexer house, it can be a bedroom for your teenage child, but if they're coming into the house to have their meals or to bath or to whatever, but it can't be a separate dwelling house where someone else lives. I suspect that if they gave permission to do that without being very careful about it, it would license the sorts of very sharp practices you see in London where people are just putting families in their sheds, which is clearly not satisfactory.
What planning permission is needed to have a tiny home parked on a plot of land that has previously had any building with foundation built on it refused? Tiny homes are typically built on trailers with minimal impact on the surrounding environment.
If you're going to have it as a self-contained home and it's coming under the Caravan Act, which it would do if it's got wheels, it's likely to anyway come under the Caravan Act, then you would still need permission for a static caravan to act as a self-contained home on a piece of land. And it might constitute a change of use. Now, you can have one there whilst you're building another house, but I think you would need planning permission, I suspect. Check with the planning lawyer, but I'm pretty sure you'd need planning permission if you wanted to just draw up to a derelict house and live in a caravan next to the derelict house. I don't think you can just take the permission for the house to imply permission for the caravan.
Do you think these are common thoughts? Are a lot of people thinking this and just give up? Similarly to the self-build of, I want to build my dream house, and then you actually can't find any land just normally?
Great point, Ben. I mean, yes, I think these are common thoughts. They certainly were very common amongst the thousands of people that we had come through the various Cube projects at the Edinburgh Science Festival, at the Grand Designs Lives that we did. But people would say, I really like this space. I'd love to have this space. Have you got any land I could put it on? And I just shrug my shoulders and say, I haven't got any more land than you have. But I did say, as you said earlier in the conversation, that there were times in my life when I was a doctoral student, when I was a postdoctoral student, I was sharing in these houses. Had I had access to the sort of facility that I had in the Cube project, it would have been absolutely fantastic. Not that I didn't get on with my fellow housemates, but I was living with housemates until I was 30 something.
What needs to change?
I think it's a commonplace, really, that the planning doesn't really serve members of communities, all members of a community, and that comes down, I think, to land. George Monbiot and colleagues have recently written a report about land reform, and there are other colleagues whose names I would have to dredge up out of my memory, who have written about land, from colleagues from Shelter and other places. There is a big issue, to my mind, of land reform. There are lots of people who've got lots of land. There's lots of... okay, so you may be thinking about this. We're in Hertfordshire. We're really not very far from the first garden city, Letchworth Garden City. And indeed, a lot of work at the University of Hertfordshire looks at the history of Letchworth Garden City and the Garden City movement. Now, the Letchworth Garden City and the other garden cities, but uniquely now Letchworth still, had a different way of administering the land. I'm not a super expert and I'll probably get the language wrong, but that land was bought up at agricultural prices originally, and it was put into the Letchworth City, whatever it was, corporation or whatever, and still owned some of it by the Letchworth Garden City Corporation, so that you didn't get what you get now, is that agricultural land can be bought by developers who then hang on to the land as long as possible until housing need becomes so desperate that the land, they then eventually get planning permission, because local authorities are so desperate for housing. They then eventually get planning permission, at which point the land value goes up tenfold. They can then build it out because they've waited so long, relying on a huge pent-up demand, and they realise all the increase in land value via a decision that has been made by a public authority. And that wasn't what happened in the Garden City movement. What happened in the Garden City movement was that the land was basically sequestered, as I understand it, through an act of parliament, or I won't get the details exactly right, you can look it up. But it was bought at agricultural prices, and only then, once enough land had been bought, then permission was granted for the building out of Letchworth Garden City. But there wasn't a huge markup, which was then realised by a private developer. What they could then do was use the money that was realised by the increase in land value to pour back into the city to build all the facilities of schools and roads and things which a city needs or a small town needs. Whereas a developer can simply take the massive uplift in land value, walk away with that, buy some more land somewhere else, and leave it to the local authority to provide the schools and the roads and the drainage and other things like that. Now, there's a Section 106s and things like that which stop them doing it entirely, but they're, as I understand it, these are not anywhere near as effective as they should be. So it's not just an issue of planning, it's an issue of land. There's also an issue of zero carbon building. Now, we are in a climate emergency. I totally agree with my friends and colleagues in Extinction Rebellion about this. Now, what absolutely amazes me is that there is any house being built now that is not either zero carbon or carbon positive. It's very, very cost effective and possible now to build houses which are on average zero carbon, or even zero carbon at all times, not even on average. In other words, they can pretty much be self-sustained. They have to be connected to the grid because they can draw on wind power from the North Sea. You don't want to put a wind turbine next to every house. And yet, when I look at every house that I see being built, I drive past housing being built, I don't see any houses that are optimized to being zero carbon. I've seen virtually no houses that have got solar photovoltaic cells instead of slates across the whole roof, where that roof is oriented towards the sun, maybe a monopitched roof. I was in Freiburg recently, where they have a a suburb of Freiburg, which has got such houses, beautiful houses, lovely gardens. You can walk amongst them. The people love them. They have all monopitch roofs, just about entirely monopitch roofs on their houses, on these rows of houses facing south, which are made up entirely of solar cells. Now, the extra cost of doing that might be, for a typical roof, about £10,000. And then you've got all the that would make you zero carbon on average for the next 25 years. And the cost of that, when you amortize it across a mortgage, much less than supplying. So the only expensive thing is having a battery big enough to get you through the bits where you're not bridged with either sun or wind blowing in the North Sea, or probably some baseload nuclear somewhere. And I've done simulations of that. I'll be writing that up in a paper. So what amazes me is that, given that we're going to have every house has got to be zero carbon basically by, let's say, 2040, Extinction Rebellion say earlier, the government says slightly later, but let's say 2040. Why would you build any house in 2019, 2020 that would need retrofitting to meet that standard if you knew that that house was going to stand for 60, 70, 80 years? I mean, why would you do that? That seems absurd. And yet just about every house I see being built is not of this type. It's nowhere near being zero carbon. So I simply don't understand it. That's a psychological problem.
Right, let's leave it there then. And thank you very much for your time.
Ben, it's been nice to meet you. And if people want to get in touch with me, I'm at the University of Hertfordshire, and you can find out my contact details through qproject.org.uk.
Head online to take a look at the show notes for this session. Mike stealing my thunder there with the web address and everything, but that will be within the show notes today, houseplanninghelp.com/262. We've made a summary of the conversation that I've just had with Mike. Also, there are photos of the cube, and we'll direct you across to them. It's probably the best place to go and have a look at some of those videos, which sometimes when you're talking about these design ideas, it is easier to see them in a video. So go and take a look at that. If you've got a comment or you'd like to ask a question, well, either find us on social media. Mike is on Twitter. We'll link that up too. Or you can do it in the show notes. Just scroll down to the bottom. There's a section there, and we'll see if we can get Mike back to answer your questions. houseplanninghelp.com/262. Finally today, a hub update, and there's a new video that we've just added to the archive. This one's on my own in-depth video case study. That's one of the features that we have in the hub at the moment. We've got 3 different builds, all of different build systems. Mine is a masonry build. It's to Passive House standard. The windows are about to go in, and they're boarding the ceiling in this video. So the air tightness layer will start just below that. We've got a membrane up on the first floor ceiling, which will then join to a plaster layer that's going to come later to continue that down. And they also do a little bit. It's funny how you see in this particular design, it's lots of little bits, but then they're all going to join together to make a wonderful airtight house. There's a bit of installation work. I think it's on the CAT slide, so we see how that is going to work and look at the plans and sort of compare that. So bit by bit, it's a jigsaw, isn't it? What I've noticed about telling you about this build is that we're always basically thinking, on a masonry build, you're always thinking about those details. Sometimes, say for example on the timber frame one, if we were going to compare that, the insulation, a lot of it is blown in at the last minute with that cellulose, whereas this, it just seems like we've been doing little bits and pieces all here, and it's all going to join up at the end. So that's the video that we've got in the hub. Also letting you know about this month's live training session. Ted Stevens, formerly the chair of NAXPA, lovely guy. He also, I think, was in command of Build It for a while. He's done his own project. No doubt we'll hear about that. But what we want to focus on is, what if you want to build with someone else? So you think, oh, this is really hard just doing a project on my own. What if you want either 2 or 4 or 6? If you want a community scheme, how does that work? How do you get involved? And he's got a lot of knowledge there. So I'm looking forward to this one, and it's going to be a good training session. You join these in. It's a conference call. We have various different topics that we change every month, and we're always open to suggestions as well from our members. Find out what else is on offer if you're a hub member. houseplanninghelp.com/join. Love to see you on the inside. That's your lot for today. Thank you so much for listening. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.